Hi, my name is David Knight, and welcome to those amazing Psalms. Psalm 50, the court is in session. Psalm 50 is an imaginative courtroom drama on a global scale that begins with God, the mighty one, Yahweh, Israel's covenant God, summoning the whole earth from east to west, from the rising of the sun to where it sets. God's throne is Mount Zion, perfect in beauty, it says. Perfect in beauty because God is there. God shines forth, literally, he beauties forth with dazzling glory, but also with a consuming fire surrounded by a raging storm. The awesome power and majesty of creation in full display. The earth and sky are summoned as witnesses as God sits to preside in judgment. Israel celebrates the coming of their sovereign God, saying, "Our God comes, and he will not be silent." You can almost hear them gleefully saying, "Here come the judge," as they eagerly await whatever their God is about to say to the nations. God calls his people to come near. In verse 5, he says, "Gather to me this consecrated people who made a covenant with me by sacrifice." Notice the triple affirmation of Israel's elite standing before God. First, they are my holy ones, the ones that God redeemed from slavery and carried on eagle's wings. Second, they are his covenant people, for he pledged himself to them. And they are his sacrifice consecrated ones. Their covenant was sealed by solemn sacrificial blood and sacred promises that each made to the other. What a high calling Israel had. I'm reminded of what Yale professor Miroslav Volf said: "We exist so that the infinite God can dwell in us and work through us for the well-being of the whole creation." What an amazing privilege and honor. Then, as God's people are gathered before all the nations and all of creation, the heavens proclaim God's righteousness and justice, essentially pronouncing God as qualified to make judgment, and every voice is silent as God speaks. Verse 7, "Listen, my people, and I will speak." And then God stuns the entire courtroom. Instead of Israel sitting as jury while the judge reads his indictment against the pagan nations, God announces that he is here to testify against his own people because he says, "I am God, your God." If God is one day going to judge the people of the earth, he can't give his own family special exemption. Judgment must begin at God's house, with God's family. In fact, he holds them to a higher standard. They have received special favor, insider information. They have a higher responsibility. Great privilege and great responsibility go hand in hand. The charges God brings against his people in this imaginative courtroom cover two arenas of life, corresponding to the two tablets of the Ten Commandments. The first tablet is how we are to relate to God. The second tablet is about how we relate to other people. The first one says, "Have no other gods, have no idols, don't profane God's name, keep the Sabbath holy," along with regulations for a whole repertoire of sacrifices and offerings. The judge says to Israel, "I don't find fault with your acts of worship, the frequent burnt offerings that you honor, but why should I want your blue ribbon bull, or more and more goats from your herds? Every creature in the forest is mine, the wild animals on all the mountains. Do you think that I feast on venison or drink draughts of goat's blood? If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you." The pagan nations thought of the gods as exaggerated human beings with superpowers and super appetites. You kept the gods in your favor by feeding them big sacrifices. In this psalm, God mocks that idea by saying, if I were hungry, which I'm not, I would grab a deer from the forest. But that's not what I'm hungry for. I long for a relationship with you. You're going through the spiritual motions, offering lots of sacrifices, but your hearts aren't in it. Trying to buy God off with sacrifices is an insult to God's honor, yet it happens everywhere. Religious activity, whether serious or superficial or superstitious, is often a substitute for real faith. Real faith is what God wants from us because he knows that's what we really need. Verse 14 says, thank offerings to God. Fulfill your vows to the Most High, and call on me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver you, and you will honor me. Basically, God urges them to offer joyful thanks and heartfelt praise with their offerings, to live up to their vow to love God truly, and to live with a spirit of trusting dependence on God. The second charge that God brings against his people, outlined in the last half of the psalm, is a much more serious expression of spiritual decline. Verse 16, but to the wicked person, God says, what right have you to recite my laws, or to take my covenant on your lips? You hate my instruction and cast my words behind you. When you see a thief, you join with him. You throw in your lot with adulterers. You use your mouth for evil and harness your tongue to deceit. You sit and testify against your brother and slander your own mother's son. When you did these things, and I kept silent, you thought I was exactly like you. The second tablet of the Ten Commandments is about how we should treat others. On this scale, many in Israel were failing terribly. They'd turned their back on God. They had adopted a me-first approach to others, lying, stealing, sleeping around, and using others for their own purposes. There is no hint of a God-governed life. Their notion of God has become merely an extension of themselves. Their ethics are diminished to what suits them. But then there's another surprise turn in this psalm. In the last two verses, the judge does not pass sentence. He has read the indictment and held up a mirror to their lives, and then he sends the guilty home the same way that Jesus closed many of his parables, saying, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Verse 22 says, consider this, you who forget God, remember who you are and who I am and what I have done for you, and change your ways. Ignore my warning, and it will tear you apart like a lion tears a gazelle. But it doesn't have to end that way. The psalm is clear that God is not looking to condemn and punish, but to call us back to his purpose, to live in vibrant relationship with him, and for God to work through us for the well-being of the whole creation. I find this psalm a brilliant, imaginative piece of theater. We have all been summoned. No one is exempt as we stand before God in his breathtaking beauty, as we stand before our families and our neighbors and all of creation. Our actions and motives are examined, and we are found wanting against both tables of the law. But this God has no joy in condemning. The full story of God's response to our failure includes Jesus, who was torn apart by our disobedience, by the whip and the nails and the spear and the thorns of evil, as he stood in for us. For us, there is therefore now no condemnation. Instead, Jesus invites us to join him on the path that honors God with all our hearts, saying to us in the final words of the psalm, if you keep to my path, I will reveal to you the salvation of God. It is only through this kind of heartfelt praise and devoted life that we begin to experience the richness of God's eternal gift to us. Whether we choose this path is up to us, but the verdict will be announced by how we live. Take care.